This is great. How many of you just talked to someone you've never spoken to before today? Yes, look at that. How many of you learned something that you didn't know before about this? Okay, this is great. Well, I'm excited, and I'm glad you all are too, and this is good. This is good coffee energy for a morning. And we're going to need it, because there's a lot to cover, and we're going to try to cover as much as we possibly can. Now, with the utmost respect to our interpreters and all of you, I'm a fast talker. I'm aware of this, so I'm going to try my best to not just run through everything I can possibly think of to say. That said, I do really get excited about this stuff. So I'm going to take a breath. You can take a breath with me. It's been a wild ride in 2025. Everything's fine, right? We're good. How many of you are bored right now? People ask me how I'm doing these days. I just say, I'm not bored. All right. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to what the organization that I work alongside does, and then we're going to jump right into it. We're going to kind of divide this into 4 parts. We're going to talk about the sector itself, and I'm going to give my best cheerleading framing of why we are so critical right now and what it takes to make sure that we stay strong and get stronger in this moment. We're going to look at the federal landscape and what's actually happening. We're going to look at the state landscape and what's actually happening. And then we're going to talk a bit about some of the dynamics in the sector. And I'm going to leave you with some thoughts about what I and we collectively think might be good for us all to consider as we go forward. So how's that for a plan in 38 and a half minutes? Let's do it. OK. So we do 3 things. We do advocacy, education, and research, essentially. So we're a membership organization, and this is not a trick. I will ask you again at the end, though. How many of you are members of the California Association of Nonprofits? All right. All right. You've all heard me say this. There are 2 types of people. There are members and future members. So you're all good by me. So we are a membership organization. We're also an advocacy organization. We're also a general education provider and occasional research and data organization. So first, I want to talk to the advocacy piece. So we believe strongly that nonprofits need to be at the table. I think you all know if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And we need to make sure that nonprofit voices are at the table. Whenever we're talking about policy setting of any kind, we also try to help people understand that it is, in fact, not illegal. It is not wrong. It is, in fact, core, and I would argue absolutely necessary for us to be engaged in lobbying, advocacy, and policy work. What we cannot do, and we'll talk about this in a moment because that landscape is also shifting, we can't be partisans, right? We can't talk about candidates, good, bad, or otherwise. We don't get involved with parties, but when it comes to policy, shaping the rules of the game, the landscape in which we all work, budgets, values, all those things, that is absolutely our business. And what we try to do is advocate for that. We also do a lot of education. How many of you have ever gone to a webinar with the CalNonprofits crew over the years? Okay, so we try to get as much information as we have, often translating what's happening at a policy level to what it means for leaders on the ground. And so we cover everything. And as I often say, it's the really sexy stuff like HR and tax policy. It's not necessarily the mission work, because you all are the experts in the mission work, and there are some fantastic organizations statewide that advocate on particular kinds of mission work. What we try to say is, here's the structural piece that we do. This is what we all have to work within when it comes to the business models and sort of the existence and support structures that lift up the nonprofit sector. And then data and research. This is really hard oftentimes for us. There is not a lot of great data for the nonprofit sector. You may have noticed this. When you try to get some just baseline numbers about anything, it can be really, really hard. That's why we're so excited that Tarek and Natalie are here with us today. And they're going to talk about some of the work they're doing, the work that NPRN is doing right now, and just shared a links to another survey about sort of what do we all need in Santa Barbara County. So we'll talk about that later too. But we try to push out good data when we see it. And when we don't, sometimes we'll jump in and try to do some work here. So what you see there are some of our favorite recent reports. I'll touch on some of them about trust in nonprofits from the independent sector. We'll look at the state of the sector, the biannual survey that the Nonprofit Finance Fund does that we're partners on. Nonprofit Compensation Associates, that's the annual survey on nonprofit compensation, North and South in California. We're partners there. And on the far right is Causes Count. That's probably my favorite thing that the organization's ever done. I'll tell you the good news after I tell you the bad news. The bad news is that's the most recent version, and it says, new findings for 2019. We're in the middle of the next one. So end of this year, early 26, there will be a whole new updated and expanded Causes Count. So something that hopefully you can use as a tool. So This is my version of things we all should know about nonprofits. And I think it's important to start here because when we think about what's our value when we're talking about the current landscape and what we do, to ground it in why we are so important, central, in fact, to our communities. There's phrases, there's a group, our peer group actually in Idaho uses the tagline, Idaho runs on nonprofits. I like that one. There's just a lot of framing right now in discussion about how central are nonprofits to our communities. So one way to think of us is this. Nonprofits do what the for-profit sector won't and the public sector can't. And we do everything else in there. And we work alongside both of them, right? So if you can't find a profit motive or a model that will actually earn revenue, for the for-profit sector isn't going to do it. There's no incentive there. And if you're doing things that fall outside of the capacities of our public sector partners, oftentimes that's where we step in. People self-organize to solve problems. And that goes way back. So this is a little old-timey here, if you know this guy or not, de Tocqueville, writing in the 1830s and 40s about what was kind of unique about this weird new country across the water from his European perspective. And a lot of it was about this self-organizing. And it is deeply in our culture that we self-organize to solve problems. We tend to have a strong skepticism of just about everything in our country, and that's, I would argue, generally a good thing. And that includes government. And we tend to say, well, you know, we're not going to wait for someone to come save us. We're just going to do this. And so that's deep in our roots. And so this is another piece that feeds what we have now built as this massive nonprofit sector. Another way to think about it, and this is from a report from our national partners that was released about 5 years ago now, I think. And they were just calling out different things that we do as the nonprofit sector. So where Americans come together to solve problems. We are promoters of civic engagement. So a lot of the time, it's the nonprofit group that's out there asking people to get engaged, whether you're door knocking and actually community organizing, or whether you're just reaching out through an email list. We're the building blocks of our own democracy. Arguably, engagement in civil society depends heavily on nonprofits saying, this is something that's important, we care about it. I know you care about it too. Let's get involved and do something about it, whatever it may be. We're often really creative laboratories. I think we're the most innovative sector out there. When people ask me, why have you spent your whole life working in the nonprofit sector? I say, because I've never met more creative people anywhere else in my life. So we can talk about innovation and entrepreneurship in lots of different contexts, but don't forget, that's where we live too. And then finally, we're economic engines, and that's where that causes count report comes from, because we often get thought of as just really nice people helping solve problems. And you're all really nice people helping to solve problems, by the way. But we're also a massive employer. We're a massive economic force. So there's a lot more that goes into it, and we need to claim that better, I think, to get a sense of where we fit into the bigger policy world. So, and if you ask people, why are you, what do you mean nonprofit? And this is true. When you ask people about nonprofits, they're often saying, well, what do you mean? Well, here's the problem. We mean literally everything. So nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. It's everything from the PTA to the biggest research universities you can think of. It's everything from the grassroots neighborhood organizing group to the child care center to the Boys and Girls Club. You name it, it's the nonprofit sector. So that's one of the challenges we have, is that when we describe who we are and what we do, it is vast. More than 2/3 of us have no staff at all. We're all volunteer organizations. In California alone, there's over 100,000 nonprofit organizations, according to our Attorney General, 109,000 as of last week. So think about the ways in which our lives connect with the nonprofit sector, and that is often valuable to help connect anybody to what our needs and challenges and issues may be. Here's the other thing. They like us. They really, really like us. This was actually, again, this is part of the old data, and we're doing a new one right now, in fact, and I will encourage us all to get involved. This was what people said when they were asked back the last time we did our report. 90% of folks in California, this was a general population survey, so this was just a community survey, resident survey in California. 90% said helping the needy and vulnerable, 85% said we improved the quality of life, 60% said we reduced inequality, 77% said we filled the gap left by government. I don't have to read the rest of the slide, you see it. But this is really important. This is how folks see us when they understand, well, what do you think of nonprofits? So, in addition to all that good stuff, and these are two just snapshots, and this is the new data you'll see soon, but We have massive economic power. We're a huge employer. In fact, in total number of jobs in California, we are the 4th largest employer by industry, if you put us all together. So that's a whole different way of thinking about us. In fact, that was the impetus a decade ago of why that report got done. We also talk about how we bring in dollars into the state. So California, in the context of the United States, is a donor state, meaning the tax base that we send federally is far greater than the tax dollars that come back to the state. This is true of the nonprofit sector. So we bring in money to the state of California, and that's partly because a lot of funders that are national or global or outside of our region fund the work that happens here or is based here in California. So again, remember, you can claim this. Yes, we're solving problems. Yes, we're innovative. Yes, we probably overwork a little bit. We'll talk about that. But also, we're a massive part of the economic structure of our communities and our state. So, have I convinced you yet? Yeah, okay, sold, good. Here's another thing that I like to add just as to the landscape before we jump into everything else, is so we are often talking, and here we are talking about this, we're talking about revenue, we're talking about fundraising. It's really important to remember, this is actually old day. This is the last time, this is done about every decade by the Urban Institute, and this was the last snapshot one that they did, so we just took it and said, this doesn't change a lot over time. Roughly half of all revenue in the nonprofit sector is earned income. We are businesses, right? We're businesses. So we're earning revenue for services, for everything we do, sometimes for things we actually create and sell. Looking at you, Megan. So we actually do a lot of things here that earn us revenue, just like any other business does. And then you have that next biggest slice. You know what that is? That is government partnerships, contracts, grants. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, because this landscape we're in now, that is very much in question. And then the remainder of that is where you find philanthropy. And the majority of that is individual philanthropy. So you got to think of all this in context, because this is not true for every organization. Some organizations are 100% earned revenue. Others are 100% government contracts and grants. Others are 100% foundation funded, maybe just a single foundation or two. Others have just an individual base. So this doesn't say anything about any organization in particular, but it does say that the whole sector is much more diverse from a revenue stream than you might otherwise think. So I think this is good grounding for us to remember when we have these conversations. And this chart is just fun because what the what? So I'll send it to you if you're interested. The Nonprofit Quarterly put this out. I love this chart, actually. It's an attempt to map revenue sources and destinations of the entire nonprofit sector. Oh yeah, this is what I do for fun. So, but you can see the whole point here is just the complexity. Like, there is a lot going on, and we are very creative, and we make very creative use of what we can find in the way of resources to do our work. So, this is the question I always start with when we're talking about engagement on policy and politics and all the things that we're talking about in our landscape today. What would our public policy landscape look like if nonprofits were leading our conversations? Just think about that for a minute. Rather than catching up after the fact, rather than responding to new rules at a hearing, rather than going to a council or committee meeting or board meeting and saying, hey, wait a minute, we often engage very well that way. We organize quick, especially when dollars are at stake and services are at stake. But what if we flip that on its head? What if any big question that came up, housing policy, environmental issues, you name it, we started with the nonprofit sector, the people on the ground who know the work best. I'd like to start there. So if there's one thing I'm going to advocate for today above all, it's this. We need to be at those tables. We need to be framing these conversations, not reacting after the fact. And it's really hard because we're not built that way. Most of us are not built to do this on a regular basis. It's a crisis usually that gets us out there. But this could be the world that we could work for, no matter what area you're working in. All right, so let's talk about what's happening. There's a lot. It is an incredibly chaotic moment at the federal level, the landscape. So what I've done is I've taken sort of 5 or 6 areas that I think are, again, directly impacting our nonprofit sector, and we're going to talk about what's actually happening, what's not, where's the signal, where's the noise, and how do we even track it? Because at this point, that's one of the hardest things, is to say, well, I heard this news clip, I heard this on a podcast, I saw this statement. Is that happening? Is it not happening? Is it in the courts? Is it where is it? So let's take a look. So this year started, and this, by the way, this is a snapshot of the Federal Register. So if you want to know, like firsthand, I'm a big believer in firsthand information, not filtered through other layers. So I go onto this website. The link is at the bottom. These will be provided to you afterwards if you ever want to do this. So I check this pretty regularly about, okay, what are the executive orders on the Federal Register that have actually been written? That's before we even talk about what they mean. 202, I believe, is the number. And this is as of last night. This is a record. So no administration has done this many this fast, and they are all over the map. I mean, literally, it's from water pressure in shower heads to government agencies' existence or not, to, I mean, literally across the entire board. Now, not all of these are equally relevant to what we all do, but it's good to know like what's being said, what's being sent from the White House. And so then we have to say, okay, so what does that actually mean for us? So this is one of the landscapes we'll talk about. The first thing that happened that got, I think, everybody's attention after that first set of executive orders was this. And this was the funding freeze memo that came out from the OMB on the 27th of January. So 1 week into the new administration, the director of the OMB issued this memo. And this is what, and I'll tell you from our perspective, so we knew that there was a lot that was going to start changing, and we set up back in, I think, November, a webinar for the 30th of January. That's what we said. We said, okay, 10 days in the new administration, we'll have a sense of what executive orders are coming and what do we need to share with people to educate the landscape about what's happening. The morning of January 27th, I think we had like 250 people signed up for this webinar. Then this started. And over the next 3 days, we had almost 3,000 people by Thursday. Because this is a massive existential threat for many organizations. Like, wait, you're saying everything, every dollar, every contract, every grant that we've already approved, signed, and are doing is going to be frozen? So this went back and forth very rapidly in about 3 days. There were 2 lawsuits. One, I'm happy to say, was the National Council of Nonprofits, our partners. They quickly, that same day, filed a lawsuit saying this is unconstitutional. The states, there were 19 states originally. I think ultimately 23 states said it's same thing from a state funding perspective. Like you actually can't do this. Congress appropriated this. We can't do it. So that's where that debate began. Who has the say in where big dollars, public dollars, federal dollars can go? And so this was an area to watch. Now, since this time, a lot of things have shaken out. Some have continued to be funded. Some have been paused. Some we don't know. Some are being considered by the courts. Some have been settled. So depending on what you do and where you're sitting, you may I don't know how many of you in this room have a federal grant that is currently in question. I imagine it's more than a few. This is one of the areas to watch. Did we just lose power? You're not supposed to see what's next. All right, so here's one that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I do want to mention because it is so important because I already talked about it. So the third area, and this is unique to this moment. This was something that has been around forever. How many of you know what the Johnson Amendment is? Okay, handful of folks. If I'd asked that question 2 years ago, most people are like, what? This is so framework, bulwark, baseline, foundational that we don't even know. It's like the air we breathe. The Johnson Amendment was introduced in 1954 by then junior senator from Texas, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He didn't do this from a high-minded place. Let me just be very clear. He had an annoying opponent who had a big nonprofit, and they were funding money through it to his opponent. And he said, I don't think that should be legal. And so, sure enough, he got introduced to the tax code, this notion that partisan politics need to stay out of nonprofits, and nonprofits need to stay out of partisan politics. Guess what? For almost, well, you can do the math, 80 years now, that has been foundational. Bipartisan, 100%. We all agree on this. This is good for both pieces of that puzzle. It keeps politics over here, keeps nonprofits over here. There's greater trust in nonprofits because they're not seen as partisan. This is what we need. So this has been there since. Now we have direct threats to this. And in fact, there are 3 right now. There's a case in federal tax court that was actually designed specifically to challenge this. And it went into federal tax court, it was last spring. And we're still waiting for it. There was a student group formed specifically to challenge this. The IRS didn't rule on it. And so now federal tax court is a very, very closed system, so it's hard to know what's happening in there. But basically, if they're granted C3 status, that essentially eliminates the Johnson Amendment, because they explicitly said, we are here to do partisan engagement. We want C3 status. We dare you to say no. The IRS didn't do anything. They got sued because they had to required to answer that in a timely fashion and didn't. So that's one thing that's out there. The second is a case that actually made the news. A couple of evangelical churches out of Texas that wanted to preach politics from the pulpit. Now, this has been a long-standing strategy for folks that disagree with the Johnson Amendment, is to kind of model it and say, well, we're going to do it anyway, and we dare you to stop us. And the IRS has not stopped them. So that's part of the challenge, that the IRS has not really gone after the folks who've done that, because it's technically a violation, but it takes somebody to enforce it. And so now there's a case where there's a consent decree that might actually get signed, which would allow at least these two entities, nonprofit religious organizations, to be partisan. The third is actually kind of a companion case, and it's one that is all about whether or not dollars can move through nonprofits for certain activities. So if you put this all together, you've got a real chance that this goes away. Now, if I were predicting today, I don't think this goes away, partly because there's such bipartisan, cross-partisan support for keeping this separation. But it's the first time in my life, probably in 80 years ever, that this has truly been challenged. Then you have H.R. 1. So this is the big bill. And everyone knows, this was talked about everywhere. So basically a tax bill, but with two major cuts to services that are largely delivered by nonprofits. One is food assistance through the SNAP program. The other is Medicare. The way this was done, it puts those impacts out into the future. So some things will be felt now. Most things will be felt over time, which means there's time to mess with that and negotiate around it. I was just talking to the head of an agency at the state level who said, yeah, well, actually, we don't really know yet what this means for us. And so this is one that we're all keeping our eye on, obviously. And this is one of those classic debates that we're used to. If you think about it, nonprofits are used to debating about funding. Like, we want to talk about funding and values and such. But the numbers were so massive in this bill that made it a whole different existential level threat for some. So this is another area that there's plenty to talk about. And of course, all of the immigration rates. And of course, our community has seen those firsthand. So one of the things I want to say about this is that local response from community, and this comes from political community, it comes from nonprofit community, it comes from neighbors and neighborhoods. No matter where you sit on this debate, the impacts on the ground were felt immediately, and there are plenty of people stepping up and saying, yeah, we're not going to let that happen. So what you've got now is a real battle in the courts, on the ground, around immigration policy. This is something that has to be solved at a federal level. It hasn't been solved, and that's why we're in this place that we're in. But if you look at the way that this has been challenged, the courts right now, it's a mixed bag. And so the courts are often where these things get hashed out. The problem is a lot of organizations that community members depend on are the nonprofit organizations. I will say that in Santa Barbara, we had actually the elected bodies put dollars into them for the first time that we've seen, and say, we're going to care for our community members, talk about the fallout from what has happened, and this is how we're going to deal with it. It's not a policy conversation, it's a humanitarian conversation for a lot of these. So this is another area that there's plenty to watch. And then I'll end with this. This is something that is sort of, in my opinion, cartoonish. There have been these hearings. There's only a handful so far. But this is where the nonprofits are simply being insulted, called names. And that's why I say it's kind of clownish and cartoonish. But these hearings, led by different congressional committees, have names like how leftist nonprofit networks exploit federal tax dollars to advance a radical agenda. But that's not the name of a hearing back in old times. The other one, the one that actually I have to say I chuckled a little bit and then I watched the hearing. Don't do that, by the way. Public funds, private agencies, NGOs gone wild. I mean, this is literally the name of the hearing on the website. These are screenshots. So this is the whole vibes thing that's happening right now, where nonprofits are being insulted, called names, called radical, called crazy, called corrupt, and all that stuff. A lot of that is noise It's not policy, but it's important to note where it's coming from and then what's the next step that happens. So I think this is where our pushback, if you ask people on the ground, they don't believe this. People love their nonprofit partners. They're part of it. They're part of us. But nonetheless, this is a performative thing that is happening that we're keeping an eye on. So yeah, it's a lot. I think it's important not to get overwhelmed, but to try to pick out the things like, okay, I'm watching that. Yes, just stop over there. Okay, no, that's serious. That's the way that a lot of us are trying to parse this stuff right now. So how do you track it? How do you know what's actually happening? Well, here's some things. These are just a handful of the organizations that we work with that try to actually say, here's what's up. And again, go to primary sources whenever possible. Independent sector has done a great job of this. National Council of Nonprofits has done a fabulous job. I'm going to show you some screenshots of what they offer you. And you can see there. Actually, the lower right, it's important to note that in our democratic system, minority committees and majority committees have rights to post their information. So that's actually the Senate Appropriations Committee. And you'll get each of those subsets of senators giving their version of what's happening. And it's right there. So it's not like you have to dig for it and everyone pretends that we all agree. It's that, okay, you think this, here's our take on it, and you can go there. And they're tracking their own stuff because the Senate is who approves a lot of this expenditure. And they said, this is what we approved, and this is what's happening to it. So if you want those primary sources, they're out there. So this is the thing that I probably go to more than anything, and I'll share this with you. This is updated periodically. So this is how you sort through all those executive orders. And the idea here is simply the National Council of Nonprofits has said, look, here's what the ones that have a meaning. So whether it's issues around DEI and identity work, whether it's around education, whether it's around anything that an executive order has directly addressed, it'll say, this is what this actually means to you. No, the law hasn't changed, or yes, this actually might change. And the thing to remember with executive orders is it's not the law, generally speaking. It's a signal from the executive branch that they would like their executive branch agencies to act differently, or reinforce something, or change something. So that's not the same as the law has changed. And so it's really important to know the difference and try to track that, because what happens in chaos like this moment, and again, it's hard to say, well, this has never happened before. There's certain things that have never happened before, but some of these debates are very, very old, and this pendulum swings. So you can take some comfort in knowing that it also swings both ways. The actual executive orders, this is a link, and what it does is it says, okay, this executive order issued on this date said this, here was the reaction. If it's in the courts now, it'll say, and here's the outcome. If it's not, if it says, here's the federal agency that's in charge, here's what happened. So just know this is a really useful resource to decode what's happening. This is another one. And this is about Doge, by the way, which still exists, by the way. It's hard to track because it was the only thing we heard about for a number of weeks and months. And now, but it's out. That notion is still there. And these are the actual cuts made by the entity that goes under the Doge acronym. And they have been tracking it by district, so by congressional district. So if you go to this map, it's a periodically updated map, and you click on a district, it'll say, well, these are the things that actually got cut or changed. So if you click on District 24, represented by Congressman Carbajal, this is what comes up. And there are actually exactly 50. I checked this yesterday. So 50 different grants and funding streams that were cut or reduced. And it lists them. It lists where they were going for, what they were approved for, by whom. So this is the stuff that just gets lost in the mix, right? But it's something that I would say if you really want to know what is happening, what does it mean, there are folks out there trying to track it for us. Lawfare is another one. Now, this is purely the legal landscape, and they've done a great job about saying, here's all of the different things that are being challenged at a court level, and it can be in all levels of courts. And again, it's really, I find, very helpful not to freak out without first saying, okay, so what's actually happening? You can freak out then. But this will tell you kind of, okay, this is the issue, this is where it's being challenged, this is what happens next. Our court system moves slow, and that's part of the challenge here is that, if the different branches of government move at very different speeds. And so this is part of the debate. This is the Appropriations Committee that I mentioned, and this is where the senators who are opposed to the cuts and the freezes have said, okay, we're going to go ahead and put up a list of what we see as being cut or frozen. And this is now in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So if you want to know, was that grant or that program really cut? Is it frozen? Is it dead? Is it just on hold? This stuff is out there. How y'all feeling right now? It's a lot. It's a lot. And what I'm trying to do here is offer some tools to say, okay, let's find out what's really happening. Because we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to get through this and to the other side. Let me brighten your day a little bit. So there's a very different context in California right now. And so let's talk about what's happening. I'm going to start with happy, happy, joy, joy, okay? Some of you know this. Some of you have been awarded this. This is something we actually started with our colleagues in the legislature in California a decade ago. And it's a very simple idea. Celebrate nonprofits. Ask every elected legislator of every district, of every party, to just celebrate a nonprofit from their district and say, we love you, you do great work, and we're going to celebrate you. It's a simple idea. We do it every year. There's 1,009 as of this year. This was the 10th year. Here's the good news. The first time we did it, 58 out of our 120 elected legislators in California went for it. They're like, okay, we'll play. This year, 118. And there were only 119 seats filled. There was one open seat. And I'm not going to tell you who didn't do it, but we're camping out on their doorstep. So literally the entire legislature gets together, says, yep, we love nonprofits, and here's what it looks like in my community, and we celebrate them. So those relationships are really important, by the way. Know your legislators, know your elected officials at all levels of government, but these are the allies that we can count on. And now I got some good news for you on the Central Coast. We have there's two structures of state government that didn't exist. And about 8 years ago, we were working with the leader of the assembly at the time, Anthony Rendon, and said, we really need a committee on the nonprofit sector in California. And he agreed. He said, great, I have no money and no time, but I support you. You organize it, we'll make it official. Great, done. And we had a brand new elected legislator at that time, named Assemblywoman at the time, Monique Limon. And I called her and I said, guess what? Speaker Rendon would support this. Would you want to do it? She's like, I am on it. And she is. She took it from that point on and has actually been the loudest voice in the state supporting nonprofits. Now, of course, she's elected to the Senate. She founded the Select Committee in the Senate when she moved over there in 21. And then Assemblymember Greg Hart took her seat on the Assembly Select Committee. So the state leadership on the select committees for the nonprofit sector are both from the Central Coast. So that's good. Yes. And that in the middle there are just some of the things that have come out of these hearings. These hearings are very much just like, let's raise some issues and talk about them. And we just had our most recent one in August. Our organization sort of does the back-end work with the two legislative offices. They put it together. There are over 20 legislators that sit between these two committees. And we just talk about what are the critical things we need that are often very much in the weeds to support the sector in California. We also have to remember that our Department of Justice in California was very clear that, like, the state has approved these things, this is what we're doing, and when the federal government says you can't do it, they go right to court. And so they do that a lot. So Attorney General Bonta, on a whole range of things that affect the nonprofit sector, have been really at our back, saying, nope, we're going to protect the nonprofit sector. We're going to protect that resource base. We're going to protect the fact that we value these organizations. This, I said we're in the weeds and we're kind of wonky, and this is the proof I'm going to offer you. This is what I spend my days thinking about. So we have a nonprofit equity initiative that we started 2.5 years ago, which is very much focused on the relationship between government and the nonprofit sector. The good news is these bills keep moving, and they get unanimous, bipartisan support in California. And it's all about, if you got to make contracting easier, make granting easier, make funding come sooner, do advance payment, pay nonprofits on time for the work that the government is asking us to do, and for those of us that have those relationships. So there's a lot here. Those top two bills are sort of next level bills. Actually, Assemblymember Hart authored the bill that got us the advance pay opportunity, but it didn't require it. And so this is the next step on that, AB 1039. This is to say, well, actually, from now on, you do have to offer that at the front end, meaning 25% of any government grant or contract coming from the state needs to be offered as upfront payment. We, as nonprofits, float debt for the state of California. I mean, that's really the bottom line. We sign a contract. They say, great, start the work. We'll pay you eventually, maybe. Probably not enough even when we do. That's us floating debt for the state. Often nonprofits are borrowing debt that is non-reimbursable. So that's not a workable system. So that's the kind of stuff we're trying to change. Everyone knows this is not okay, but changing the massive state bureaucracy of California, the independent nation state of California, as we sometimes call it, is massive. It's huge. There are these huge agencies with long-standing cultures. 880 is a similar one. This is about the exemption in the Prompt Payment Act that says that if you pay a for-profit contractor late, you get a mention on the wall of shame, and there's actually a penalty. But if you pay a nonprofit contractor late, whatever. That's literally the exemption in the bill. And so we think that's, of course, ridiculous, and so we're trying to close that. And then there's also other things in there about appropriate levels of payment and indirect cost rates. So California's fallen way behind the national standard on this. And of course, California likes to see itself as in the lead, and so we're saying, well, great, why don't you be in the lead? This other bill is one that actually nonprofits were stripped out of, and so we let it go. Here's a couple others that we work on, and I won't go into all these. If you want to talk more about this, we can talk about it. But there are always policy agenda items that we're working on behalf of the sector at a state level. This one is actually the most interesting, probably, and this just passed off the Senate floor. Not unanimously, but with massive support. And this is a sort of a proactive bill that would say if, and it has been threatened, we don't know if it's going to happen, but a lot of threats have come from different federal agencies saying we're going to strip, we don't like what you're doing, we're going to take away your nonprofit status. If that actually were to happen, what could California do? Well, California could say, we have our own nonprofit status, and we do, we always have. We just always default to the 501c3. So this is where we say, well, in California, if you get your nonprofit status stripped because somebody in the federal government doesn't like you, we would still treat you as a nonprofit in California. So that's one way that we can bolster the sector. This is a tool that I'll just let you, you can use that QR code. You can look on the website. We'll also get to you. This is something that was very simple, but we thought, well, what about a catalog of our entire legislature for the nonprofit sector? Just who are the 120 people that sit up there in the Assembly and Senate? Where do they come from? And specifically, what's their relationship to nonprofits? So these are half-page bios on every member of the legislature. We're updating it constantly. And if you want to know, I mean, you may know your own legislators here. Of course, we have very engaged ones in the nonprofit world here. But you may not know that up in Butte County, one of your best allies was elected up there, and they work on this issue, early childhood education. You didn't know that. So if you're trying to move something at a state level, you may have an ally there. So this is something that is free and open to anyone who wants to use it. This is something we're pitching, and we're going to try to build some momentum for it over the next year and a half. We really need an office in California that can help navigate all this. We do hundreds of billions of dollars in business with the state as a nonprofit sector, and we need somebody at the state level to help manage that, to help introduce better practices, to normalize good culture, and basically be an ombuds person. So when there's a problem with a grant or an issue with state funding, that there's a way to fix it. So this is something that we're advocating for. The cost would be incredibly low considering how much time and money and wasted time and money it would save in the relationship between nonprofits and our government. So what does this all mean? So in closing, let's take a look at what we're seeing. This is a little word cloud because everyone has to have one. I know it feels very 2015 now when I look at it, but whatever. We survey our own members and say, what's happening, what's up, what do you need, what's going on, and you won't be shocked by any of the words in the cloud. You're going to hear from Tarek and Natalie shortly here about what they've seen now with their local work, so I'm going to be really high level here, but this is statewide. We asked a lot of questions. Here's the big ones, though. We had a really good response. It's actually double the normal response on all of this, so really high engagement. How would you describe your current situation? This is eye-opening to a lot of folks. If you look at the number one answer, holding steady, but experiencing some challenges. So it's like, it's a little rough, but we're holding it together. That is actually the majority experience, and we're talking about nearly 60% there. Stable and growing. This is the one that surprises a lot of people. But think of it this way. When you are directly attacked for existing as a nonprofit in the particular work you do, sometimes that galvanizes support. It certainly galvanizes allies to get together and try to connect and protect the work. So there's actually entities right now that are like, well, because of the landscape we're in, we're doing great. And then you see that almost 17% there are like, no, this is existential. So significant challenges here. We probably cutting staff. We may or may not exist next year. So that's obviously where our eyes are, looking to see what we can do. And as far as why, funding uncertainty, 80%. Surprise! Staff and workforce challenges. This is a rising one. Like, what is the sustainability of our sector? This is one we've always struggled with. We're generally undercompensated. We do a lot of things to say, well, we're just going to make it work. That's that entrepreneurial spirit we all have. We're all here for the mission. The problem is, on the downside, we often undermine ourselves, and we know this. This is a long-standing challenge. High cost due to inflation, no surprise. You can see there the full list. Here's two things. This is a snapshot from a study that literally was released this week that Bonterra did, and I think it's actually a pretty good one, so I'm sharing two snapshots. The impacts vary widely with type of organization and size. One of the things that we discovered when we did our report is, nonprofits almost never get really large without government contract support partnership. So most smaller grassroots nonprofits are raising money, passing the hat within their immediate community or maybe a couple of foundations. But as they get bigger, they're much more dependent on public sources, because usually it's a government agency saying, we need you to do this, and here we're going to fund it. So you can see here that there is a lot of correlation between the size of the organization and the type of work it does. And we're back. Thank you. So the other one I will show you is, this is asking funders. So what are you doing in this moment, this chaotic, crazy moment? What are you doing? Well, the upshot is most funders are pausing and thinking about it. And of course, we're going to talk a lot about this today. This is the Partnership for Excellence Conference. But in this pool, and this was, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's 2,600 nonprofits across the country and 107 funders that responded to this. So this is not everybody, but a majority are basically saying, we're taking a breath, we're trying to figure out how we can be most useful right now. And you can see there's a couple of other answers that are much smaller at the moment. And the question is, so what do you need to know to decide how if you change anything, and if so, how? Other trends I'm going to breeze through before I wrap up here. Giving continues to grow. If you pay attention to the annual survey from Indiana University, the Lilly School, this is the Giving USA summary. So we're approaching $600 billion in private giving in the United States. Continues to grow. It even grows generally through recessions. At the worst, it kind of flatlines, but it keeps growing. But it's not keeping up with inflation in the last few years in particular. So it's not a dismal scene, but there are trends within it that are actually quite worrying. This is one of them. The way the tax law changed in 2017 actually disincentivized a lot of giving for lower income earners and those with fewer resources. So what we're seeing is, even though the total is still kind of going like this, who's in that bucket has changed radically. It's far more people at the extreme high end of wealth and assets and income, and far fewer in the lower range. And that's historically anomalous, because historically, giving is something that cut across every income level. And it still does, but it's actually skewing quite extreme now. And a lot of that is tax incentive. In fact, the numbers that came out of this, American Enterprise Institute did this study, 23 million fewer itemizers. That equated to roughly a $20 billion annual decline in giving. So meaning 20 billion more would have been given had that change not happened for those that are doing it based on tax incentive. And that's not the only reason people give, obviously. But when it does make a difference, it's cumulatively, that's not small money. Now, of the 600, 20 billion is a small piece, but $20 billion is $20 billion. The other one is concerns about the workforce. We're seeing more and more studies on that. We're doing one right now, which I'm going to ask for your help on. But what does it mean to be a worker in the nonprofit sector? The ALICE measure that United Way has come up with, working with partners, has been a really good one to kind of say this is what it means. Asset limited, income constrained, and employed. See, ALICE acronym, it's a good acronym. You can repeat that to your friends. So there's a lot there about what does that actually mean. And so in closing, I just want to say there's a few things that I think we can do with all of this stuff. And this is really it. Just remember that executive orders and memos and signals are not the final word. They're simply saying this is what we believe, this is what we're trying to do, and this is what we're asking those agencies over whom we have control to do. So be clear on what's the noise, what's the signal, what's the actual rule or law change, and what's the signal of values. There are 342 active lawsuits right now challenging various federal moves. So that is massive, as unusual, and we'll have to see. We don't know where those all land. We've seen some of them, but the vast majority are still very much being contested. Every time somebody comes at you as the nonprofit sector with anything, just remember that's a moment to educate. It's a moment to claim your values. It's a moment to say this is why we do what we do, and this is why we're so valuable, and this is why people love us and write us checks and depend on us. So yes, it can feel like a real barrage, but it's also a chance to say, and this is why we do it. So I think that's useful for all of us. Don't overcorrect. Risk mitigation is important. You got to be clear on what's at risk for you, and it depends on what you're working on. There are certain areas of work right now that are absolutely being targeted, and it is risky to do that work. So know what it is. But don't just say, this is way too chaotic and confusing, we're just going to pull back from it, because we saw some of that early on, and that's really tragic. Because most of the work that we've all done is absolutely legal, embraced, good work. So even if somebody disagrees with it, you have that debate, that's fine. But don't take that as like, we can't do that anymore. And then finally, those of us that are in relative positions of safety and power, and first of all of philanthropy, I would argue, should be thinking this way. And large entities that are really not dependent on public funding, and organizations that are very much doing non-controversial work. Like, remember to step forward, defend the work, the sector, your friends and colleagues, because there's some folks that really can't do that right now. And we shouldn't be pointing fingers and doing the circular firing squad thing. We need to be saying, nope, this is important work, we stand by it, and we're just going to make our position really clear. And nobody's come to save you. Sorry. State government, this is what we heard. I'm being a little facetious here. There is no general fund solution to the federal budget cuts. Every legislator this year basically said that. Every committee meeting we were in, everybody we talked to in Sacramento, the state is not going to come fill the budget gap. Good to know. And that's real. Until it's not. Sometimes like, oh, but we can do this. Okay, fine, good. Glad you did that. But there's not, just the sheer math of it doesn't work. And guess what? Foundations can't do it either. This graphic is actually from 2019. And I use it on purpose because I'm like, this is not new, believe it or not. At the time, the White House was proposing a $193 billion cut to SNAP. Guess what just passed? A $187 billion annual cut to SNAP. So this was the same question then. And so this stacks up. If the 15 largest foundations just gave it all away today, they wouldn't even fill the gap. So this isn't going to happen this way either. But here's what we need to remember. Funders can do some really interesting and creative things. Talk to your grantees. I know some of you do this really, really well. Just ask them what they need. These are folks we know each other, right? If you're on either side of that relationship. Lift restrictions. Consider taking that restricted grant and just saying, you know what, you need to do what you need to do, and we're going to support you to do it. I'll remember that was an applause line. Reduce or temporarily eliminate or try verbal, or just, again, move barriers out of the way. For reporting, if you had a big form or a way that you used to do it and you realize, you know what? We don't have to do it that way, right now at least. Try it. Try something different. Use the moment to try to experiment. Temporarily increase endowment payments. Folks in this room have done that. My alma mater, the Fund for Santa Barbara, did it. Thank you, Fund. Others had done this and just moved money. And I would argue, like, if there's ever a time to just do it, this is the time. You know, we had this through COVID, too, where people said, you know, well, that's rainy day money. I'm like, well, it's raining. Same dynamic right now. And the good news is, like a pandemic, you know, this too shall pass, and I believe that firmly. Like, you know, this is a rough period. Things will be changed. Some things will be severely damaged, but things will find there will be something on the other side of it. So take this moment, these next 1, 2, 3 years, whatever it is, and consider changing it. Here's one that I think needs to be said out loud. 501c3, expenditure authority. Every foundation has the ability to fund any organization that they will stand up and say, this passes 501c3 muster. You don't have to be a 501c3, and you don't have to have a letter from the IRS. Most foundations, and most foundation leaders that I talk to, are not aware of this. Again, my colleagues at my alma mater, we did a lot of experimenting with this in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and said, well, you know, we'll take that burden on. So if the IRS ever questions us as a foundation and says, why did you fund that? We just have to have an answer, that we did some homework and actually use the IRS's test. So every foundation could do that, but they don't, because it's much easier to just say, well, IRS, you said they were a 501c3, here's the letter you wrote. So that's end of conversation. But it doesn't have to be that way. So this might be a time, especially if folks start getting their status revoked, to think about it. Supporting legal defense of the sector. You know, this is really valuable right now. So if you find that there's a whole sector that you're supporting that is being attacked in a way that could be challenged through courts, do it. Support policy, advocacy, and lobbying work. You know, you've heard that refrain. I will always say that. Just remember, it's not scary. It's not dangerous. You just have to know the rules and get folks engaged at the table and say, this is why we do this work. These are the values. This is what it costs to do the work. These last two, some people are like, what are you talking about? You can spend down. Foundations don't have to be here forever. Some absolutely have made the decision, we're going to be here forever. This is why. Fine. I understand. You have the governance authority to do that. But right now, there are foundations saying, gosh, you know what? Maybe 20 years. Maybe we'll spend it over 20 years. Maybe it's 10 years. Maybe we'll just spend this much, and however long that lasts, that's what we'll do. So I would say this is a time to just question all those norms and assumptions. If you land and your board lands back to we're here to be here in perpetuity, then fine. You absolutely can do that. But if you're not that attached to it, and some really aren't, they just like, well, I kind of inherited this. This is kind of how we do it. You know, I inherited this job. I inherited this work. And so this is, again, a great time to say, well, strategically, what could you do differently? And then finally, just use the position you have. Speak up. So there's my list of 9 things that I hope our philanthropy partners can do. There are plenty of good media messaging things happening out there in the world, spreading the word. This is actually a prototype of something NCN is doing. You may see versions of this coming out in California. This is done for other states right now. But again, just framing, why are we so important? These are some good ones. I mentioned a survey. I will ask you all, if you're on our mailing list, you've gotten this. We will keep pushing it. I will probably find a way to sneak this into an email that Judy sends you after this. But we want to know what it means to be a frontline worker in the sector. So we're not asking executive directors and CEOs. There's better data there. We're asking everybody else in the organization. Like, what do you need? How is it going? What are you finding? Because when we do this report, we're going to be measuring a lot of that. Join with us in LA. We do a policy conference every year. You're all invited. It's filling up fast. Become a member. I told you I'd say it again. And I'm not saying just CalNonprofits. Join with your peers and colleagues, because that's really the power of the moment. And then just connect. Just get on the list. Here, ask what's going on. These are what we send, but again, I'd say if you have a peer group that you're kind of like, yeah, we're kind of a member, get involved with them, right? I mean, this is the time to show solidarity and connection with the sector. So thank you. for everything you do, and for listening to me go off like that for longer than I was supposed to.